So in 1818, which was actually the second explosion of the total, because they'd only been making gunpowder now for about 14 years. I'll get to the first one here in a moment. But in 1818, they employed about 40 people. And 34 of them were killed in a large explosion. This is also where the first woman was killed in an explosion. And her story is quite a bit different. I forget if I refer to her. I think I do. So let's hold off on that. But remind me if I don't bring it up. In 1915, early stages of World War I, America, of course, was not in the war at that point. The second largest number, 30 men were killed, and I'm going to highlight several of those because, fortunately, the newspapers at the time had good pictures and good biographies of these men. In 1847, 18 were killed. In 1863, the middle of the Civil War, 13 people. And in 1890, that's the one where the woman and the child, her grandson, were killed by the falling house. All right, so if you've been to Hagley, you've seen this. These wheels rotate. They're 8 tons each, and they are the mixing place. They're called a roll mill. These wheels travel around, I'm guessing 8 times a minute, maybe, depending on how much water we're letting flow into the machinery that runs this. Three ingredients. The 3 ingredients are charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, or potassium nitrate. Okay. The roll mills were always built in pairs because they had one of those machines between each one. And here's an example of the aftermath of one of the explosions. Now, the first thing you have to understand is there was probably no roof to begin with. Okay? A lot of these were built without a roof, or maybe a canvas roof, or in the wintertime, perhaps a plywood roof, very thin wood. But the main thing I want to turn out, or to show you here, is you see the cracks in the walls? Those are 3 or 4 inches. That stone, which all the stone at Hagley came from the Hagley grounds. Okay? They had 7 or 8 quarries, and each quarry would produce the stone. It's called Delaware granite. It's called Wilmington blue rock. Probably has several other names. To me, the best name is Delaware granite, which gives you an idea how solid it is. All you had to do was push those stones back, regrout them, and you were good to go. Now, in the original, you'll notice this open space here. You can't see it in this display, but if you come to visit us, we can show you inside there. That's where the machinery was. There's a 4-ton gear underneath there that the water power turns. Okay, but notice the wheels, 8-ton wheels, pretty much intact. All right, here's another example. This is actually a Hagley display of one of the last explosions in 1920. It was not the last, it was the last large one. All right, and this is a missile map. Now, it's a little hard to see, but from the center where the explosion occurred, it's about 1,800 feet out to here. And each of these small dots, which I'm not sure you can see that clearly from here, indicate where the missiles or the particles from that explosion, stone, steel, whatever, flew. A couple of interesting stories in the book about one gentleman got out of bed about 6:30 in the morning. This occurred about 2 minutes later, and it was a good thing he got out of bed because one of those missiles, which is 3 or 4 tons of steel, landed on his bed. And so that's the 1917 explosion. All right. So why did explosions happen? Nobody knows. Now, somebody tried, a guy by the name of Francis Gurney DuPont, who came along around 1850, lived into the 20th century. He obviously worked there. He kept meticulous records. I'm going to show you one here. And I don't ask you to read it, but you'll notice he put in the margin, the powder was too dry. And the upper one, the powder was too dry. Notice, the powder was too wet. Okay? This puzzled me for a very long time until I read a book about the Confederacy building their Augusta, Georgia plant, their powder plant, in 1863. And as I was reading through there, I saw something that ticked my interest. And what it looks like is that, remember the two 8-ton wheels? They ride over the dry powder. Okay? So if there's a chunk of that powder, those 8-ton wheels aren't going to necessarily crush it. They're going to go over the top of it. They're going to go over the top and slam down. Okay? So that's my guess as to why he would write too wet. Again, he would stick in newspaper clippings in his book, and then he would write in his distinctive style, which is mostly readable if you spend time with it. And so, let's go here. So we've talked about the when, the why, the how, the where. Now let's talk about the who, but not that who. Okay? So we're going to talk about the very first explosion that killed someone. June 8th, 1815. Richard and his brother Patrick were the first of 17 Dohertys, or Dohertys, depending on how you want to pronounce it, to be killed. And I've put this in the book. It was said that the best way to avoid dying in an explosion was not to be named Doherty.
Wow.
Okay. Another gentleman who died was Francis Leonard, along with 6 others in that first explosion. So there were 8 people killed. And in March of 1816, the DuPonts got a letter from a woman by the name of Christiana Cream, who was living in Delaware, knew about the explosion, and she was wanting to know whether her husband was one of the unfortunates who was killed. He was German, spoke broken English, went by the name of Francis Leonard, but when he was at home, he went by the name Francis Cream. And I don't know why. I don't know why he would do that. But what I want to point out here is, if you have never seen this term, her mark, in your reading, her mark means that the person was illiterate and didn't know how to sign their name. So they just put an X there. Okay? And then they actually would say, her mark, Christian Cream. So that's the format. I don't know that she ever got an answer from the DuPonts. All right, this again was the worst accident in the history of the Brandywine. 34 out of 40 men were killed. The DuPonts had to halt for about 6 months in making black powder because they didn't have anybody to do the work. However, I should also add that typically after a large explosion, when several men are killed, there was always a line at the hiring office for people who wanted to work in the powder. Okay? And I like to tell people that it's safer than farming. It was safer than farming, railroading, manufacturing, and mining. It was safer than all of those professions to work in the black powder, as long as you followed the rules. You didn't bring in your own metal tools. You had wooden tools provided by the DuPonts for scraping and mixing and so forth, and shoveling out and so forth. So as long as you use those wooden tools, you were usually okay. All right. So this is where the wife of one of the dead powdermen died. I'll try to tell that story as quickly as I can. It gets a little involved, but you have to understand that when there was an explosion, the women would always run down to the gates, which were, far away from the powder yard, and there was a guard there. There's always a guard on the gates. And the women would say, whose mill was it? And a lot of the mills were named, you know, individual mills were named for the person who was the operator of that mill. So whose mill was it? Well, a woman by the name of Ann Toner, and I think this is where I get to it, she carried her 3-year-old daughter, Eliza, down to the gate to ask whose mill was it. And as she was going down there, a condemned ammunition ball cooked off from a second explosion and intercepted her and killed her. She dropped the child, of course. She was dead instantly. The child later became, I don't think I say it here, but Eliza later became a nursemaid for Lamont DuPont. Okay? The 3 Toner children became orphans. Her husband Michael was killed in the explosion. All right, we move up to 1832. In August, there was a 6-year-old by the name of Mary Toy. If you do any reading about Hagley, eventually you'll run across the name Toy. They owned a tavern not far from the gate. And Mary's 6-year-old father died in an explosion. In 1863, she lost her husband in another explosion. So both her father and her husband were killed. But, like the other widows, she received $100 a year for life, as long as she remained unmarried and stayed on the property. If she moved off the property, went west, or if she remarried, she wouldn't get that $100 a year. She also got, of course, got free room. They also had space on the property for gardens. They could keep animals, sheep, goats, cows, to provide for their needs. Sons would be guaranteed a job working in the powder if they wanted to. Daughters also were guaranteed a job, not in the powder, but perhaps in a DuPont home. If you ever go to what's called the soda house, which is where they stored sodium nitrate, which came along later as an ingredient to powder, it's now it's an adjunct to our library at Hagley. If you ever want to do local genealogical research, good place to go. A lot of my research was done there, clearly. And they have these big 10-pound books. They're called petit ledgers. Petit, of course, in French means small, but they're not small. They're this big, and they weigh about 10 pounds, and they're about this thick. There's a page for every man working or for their estate if they died. Okay? And the page very clearly shows January's pay, February's pew rental, because they would pay for church, $2 a year for their rental of their pew at church, and those kinds of things. And the petit ledgers were just a really, really good mechanism for the DuPonts to keep the records. And you could look at yours at any time to know exactly how much money you had. You had the money with the DuPonts because the closest bank's miles away in Wilmington. The good thing is they paid you 6% interest on any money that you kept with the DuPonts. Okay? And you could go get it any time. You just go to the office and say, I need money. Okay? One of the workers, as you can see there, saved almost 80% of his income. Not a whole lot of places to spend money. There were stores off-site. They were not company stores, but they were just outside the grounds, and you could keep an account with them. You never had to exchange money. You could set up an account. They would just debit the DuPonts out of John Doe's account. All right, so another gentleman who died was Joseph Babby, or Baby, we're not sure, because we've seen the different names. At the end of the Civil War, he quit, because he was afraid. He was afraid he was going to be killed in the powder. And so try to remember the roll mills that I showed you with the explosion. What you saw in front of that was the creek, Brandywine Creek, okay? And then on the other side, this gentleman was traversing. He was walking along the other side. An explosion occurred, killed him, okay? So ironically, Joseph Babby still died in the powder, even though he was afraid of it, okay? So, gentleman around 1950, I think, wrote a book called Alfred I. DuPont, The Family Rebel. And he said, whenever two powder men fell to reminiscing, sooner or later something would come out concerning Jonas Miller. Jonas Miller was 14. He left home very close to where the barn is on 202. I forget what it's called.
Blue Ball? Blue Ball?
Blue Ball, yeah, the Blue Ball barn. His father actually owned that property for a period of time. He left to seek his fortune, so you can kind of imagine, stick with a rag tied on the back of it, and he gets to the creek, and there's no bridge there, of course, but there is a ferry, and that ferry was operated by Victor DuPont, E.I. DuPont, the founder's older brother. And this was in, like I say, 1818, okay? So he's on this raft with Victor and a couple of other people, and they hear this explosion. So they all get to the other side, and they all rush up to help, including Jonas. He helped during the aftermath of the explosion and was given a job right then and there by the DuPonts, probably as an apprentice at 14, but he stayed for 55 years, and he was killed in a fire and explosion in 1873. So he was able to avoid, mostly avoid injuries throughout his entire 55-year work life at DuPont. All right, I mentioned this earlier. The big one was in October of 1890. This was the one where they had more than 50,000 pounds. They estimate now between 50,000 and 100,000. 400 people were left homeless. They have pictures where for about a mile around the site of the explosion, the farm fields, because the DuPonts had a lot of property and farmed it, were just flattened. And so, again, the second woman and the first child known to have died. Now, when I say known to have died, the thing you have to understand about record keeping is that it's not immaculate. Okay? The DuPonts kept very, very good records. You can go to the soda house and look up all the DuPont records up to 1902, when they were forced to split because of antitrust laws. And up to that, if what you're looking for is between, 1800 and excuse me, 1920, or I'm sorry, 1902, you're going to find probably what you need if it's got something to do with Hagley. Okay. All right. So this is a picture of Sam Buchanan in 1906, just as mourners were gathering in his home, which was where they held funerals back then. The workers found his hand as a result of losing it in an explosion. And they gave it to the undertaker, and he surreptitiously put it back in the coffin, and the family was very thankful that he had done this. February 2, 1906, I think he was only one of two to die in that explosion. Okay, November 30th, I talked about 1915, World War I was underway, but not with Americans. It had the second highest fatality rate, 30 men were killed. What's called the pack house, which is the final step other than storage, it's where they packed the powder into kegs and barrels. And this is Elmer Mace, who was if you can read that, Elmer was a teamster. He was driving some horses, and he was too close to this particular explosion. It didn't always have to be the men in the powder, directly working in the powder mills. He was transporting material from one side to another, but he just happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. Another gentleman, young man clearly, in this explosion. It was mostly young men. I didn't do an average age, but I would guess it's around 22, 24. And he's probably about that age. Another one who died in that explosion was Harry Haber. And the guy who I find the most fascinating, Alan Thaxter. He died in that explosion. Little military input here. He was in the class of 1903 at VMI, the Virginia Military Academy. Any guesses as to who else might have entered VMI in 1903? George S. Patton. Yep. Patton completed his 4 years and of course went on. Okay. Thaxter was there for a year. And as you can see, when somebody wrote in the 20th century, or well, I can't see the date on here, but anyway, nobody knew the name. Whatever number of years later, can you see a date on there? Mark now.
Yeah, 1903, matriculated.
Okay, 1915, yeah. So 12 years later, nobody had heard of him. But because he must have been quite a trifler, all right? He was not a military man, clearly. All right, so he was the adopted son of a very, very well-to-do family in Portland, Maine. His father, Sidney Thaxter, 30 years after the end of the Civil War, was awarded the Medal of Honor. I'm guessing it was a political Medal of Honor because it was 30 years after the war, and typically, medals of honor were right after the wars or during. The recruiter found him working at the Hotel DuPont, which had just opened a couple years before, and before that he was a stockbroker. So here's a guy who's a rich man's son, right? And he's working in gunpowder. You can speculate why he was doing that. He wanted perhaps to set his own path and not be a rich man's son. Unfortunately, he was killed in the 1915 explosion. He was the only person of the 30 who were killed that day whose body was able to be identified immediately because of what he wore. And somebody remembered that that was Alan Thaxter who wore that. He was kind of the foreman, actually, in the pack house that blew up. That's the one, I think, right behind the steam engine. Yeah, I think that's the one. All right, so I said earlier that a lot of Irish workers were working for the DuPonts, and along around 1870, quite a few Italians started coming in, and one of them was this gentleman, was killed in January 5th, 1917. That's him on the left, and they're actually shaking left hands. That's the original picture. I didn't reverse it. He left DuPont 3 times and came back. In a couple of those times, he went to Italy. He was a widower. He remarried. He opened a fruit stand, was fined by the court for opening a stand without having a building behind him. And he raised 4 daughters as a widower. The last time he went to Italy, he remarried, and his wife did not return with him to the Brandywine. He came alone with his girls. This is just kind of an example of the kinds of things that historians look at. You have a lot of great stuff like this in your museum. These are pictures of the original documents from Italy regarding his marriage. One of these is a statement that he's okay to go to the United States because he's not a criminal. And one of them might be a birth certificate. I don't have my notes with me, so I can't remember. But these are the kinds of things that we look at. So at 15, his daughter Helen, who's seated on the right, she just got married, she found a pistol in the store where she was working. She said she was tired of living, tried to shoot herself, kill herself. She was unsuccessful, thank goodness. But 6 years later, as you can see, she died in the Spanish flu at the death. Okay, probably 1918. This is her marriage picture. The person on the far right is Sadie, her sister, one of the 4 daughters of Charles Sicko. And she also opened up a food stand in Wilmington. All right, so notice there are 25 pictures in those circles. That was the number of children that this woman had. Okay? And the one who was killed in the powder is this one right here. His name is Calvin. Right there. Calvin Swartwood. All right? In that last major explosion where I showed you, not the missile map, but where I showed you the remnants, the aftermath shot, this is where he was killed. I just thought it was interesting that he was one of 25 children. All right, another military man, James A. Hodge. He was in the 1st Division, 1st Sanitary Train, Field Hospital number 3 during the Great War, World War I. He medically assisted at several battles, including Soissons, where he may have treated the injured Sam Ervin. You may remember that name from Watergate days. He was a senator. Or he might have treated Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Both were injured during that battle. He returned to the United States on the USS DeKalb. This ship was later used to bring immigrants to the U.S. and actually it was one of the interned ships that the Americans took over that were in port in America when the war started. He was one of the last 2 victims of gunpowder. He died with a friend. They were not scheduled to work long that day, but his friend had to work long and asked him to stay, and as a result he was, again, one of the last 2 to perish. All right, this is not an ad for DuPont. It's simply to tell you that the DuPonts stopped making gunpowder in 1921, in part because the war had ended 3 years earlier, and the DuPonts dumped millions of pounds, the government dumped millions of pounds of powder on the market, which lowered the price, and this whole water-powered thing was pretty old. They could make powder in other places, and they did until the 1970s, 50 years ago, in other locations, Colorado, Washington, New Jersey. So I'm offering my book. If anybody would like a copy. marriage. One of these is a statement that he's okay to go to the United States because he's not a criminal. And one of them might be a birth certificate. I don't have my notes with me, so I can't remember. But these are the kinds of things that we look at. So at 15, his daughter Helen, who's seated on the right, she just got married, she found a pistol in the store where she was working. She said she was tired of living, tried to shoot herself, kill herself. She was unsuccessful, thank goodness. But 6 years later, as you can see, she died in the Spanish flu at the death. Okay, probably 1918. This is her marriage picture. The person on the far right is Sadie, her sister, one of the 4 daughters of Charles Sicko. And she also opened up a food stand in Wilmington. All right, so notice there are 25 pictures in those circles. That was the number of children that this woman had. Okay? And the one who was killed in the powder is this one right here. His name is Calvin. Right there. Calvin Swartwood. All right? In that last major explosion where I showed you, not the missile map, but where I showed you the remnants, the aftermath shot, this is where he was killed. I just thought it was interesting that he was one of 25 children. All right, another military man, James A. Hodge. He was in the 1st Division, 1st Sanitary Train, Field Hospital number 3 during the Great War, World War I. He medically assisted at several battles, including Soissons, where he may have treated the injured Sam Ervin. You may remember that name from Watergate days. He was a senator. Or he might have treated Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Both were injured during that battle. He returned to the United States on the USS DeKalb. This ship was later used to bring immigrants to the U.S. and actually it was one of the interned ships that the Americans took over that were in port in America when the war started. He was one of the last 2 victims of gunpowder. He died with a friend. They were not scheduled to work long that day, but his friend had to work long and asked him to stay, and as a result he was, again, one of the last 2 to perish. All right, this is not an ad for DuPont. It's simply to tell you that the DuPonts stopped making gunpowder in 1921, in part because the war had ended 3 years earlier, and the DuPonts dumped millions of pounds, the government dumped millions of pounds of powder on the market, which lowered the price, and this whole water-powered thing was pretty old. They could make powder in other places, and they did until the 1970s, 50 years ago, in other locations, Colorado, Washington, New Jersey. So I'm offering my book. If anybody would like a copy, I'll sign it for them. And I invite your questions or comments. Yes, sir.
Yes, afternoon, it's a firm. Question is,